She was the most powerful woman on earth. She had 9 children. She would outlive 3 of them. The first of those 3 would die on the exact same date as the husband she had spent 17 years mourning. She ruled an empire spanning a quarter of the globe. In 17 years, she gave birth to 9 children. She orchestrated their marriages into every royal house across Europe. Without ever knowing it, she carried within her a single defective gene that would ultimately contribute to the fall of the Russian Empire. How does the mother of European royalty end up burying her own children, and then witness from beyond the grave as the disease she passed on killed her grandchildren and great-grandchildren thousands of miles away? Her name was Queen Victoria, and what happened to her 9 children? 3 of whom would die before she did, one of whom carried a condition no one in 1853 even had a name for, and one of whom would spend the final 3 decades of her life burning her mother's private diaries, page by page in a courtyard, is the most quietly devastating chapter of the entire 19th century. In the following account, you'll discover what her son Bertie did at a military camp in 1861, a single weekend with a single Irish actress that Victoria would blame for the rest of her life for her husband Albert's death 3 months later. Why her youngest son Leopold was forbidden from running, climbing, playing, or doing anything a child normally does, and what doctors discovered about her bloodline only after his body was brought home from France, and what her youngest daughter, Beatrice, spent her final 30 years doing in the privacy of a small fire pit, a methodical, daily destruction of evidence that historians today will never recover. What you're about to hear isn't simply a story about a queen. It's a story about what happens when a mother who controlled the marriages of every royal house in Europe could not, in the end, control the bodies of the children she had given birth to. It begins, as so many royal tragedies do, with a date on a calendar. The 14th of December. Remember that date. It will return. She was 18 years old when she became Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It was the morning of June 20, 1837. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain had ridden through the night from Windsor to Kensington Palace. They were received in a small drawing room. The young woman they had come to inform, a slight, dark-haired girl, barely 5 feet tall, dressed in a hastily wrapped white dressing gown, listened to them in silence. She thanked them. She asked for an hour alone. She used that hour to write 3 sentences in her diary. She wrote, "I am very young, and perhaps in many, though not in all things, inexperienced. But I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have." She did not write about her mother. She did not write about her tutor. She did not write about the empire that had just become hers. She wrote, instead, about the man who had not yet entered her life. Here is the part of Queen Victoria's life that nearly every biographer races past, because it does not fit the iron, black-clad widow she would become in old age. The young Victoria, in the years before her marriage, was passionately, almost helplessly romantic. She filled her private journals with sketches of her German cousin Albert. She had met him exactly twice. By the age of 17, she had decided she would marry him, before he had decided anything at all. She married him on February 10, 1840. She was 20, he was 21. She gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Victoria, called Vicky. Exactly 9 months and 12 days later, on November 25, 1840, she would give birth to 8 more children over the next 16 years. And in the body of that first newborn, a small, dark-haired princess who would grow up to become Empress of Germany, was already present, dormant and silent, a single broken gene that Victoria had inherited from her own bloodline. She did not know it was there. She would never, in her entire 81 years of life, fully understand what she had passed on. But by the time her last surviving descendant carrying that gene died in Spain in 1938, more than half a century after Victoria's death, it would have killed at least 9 of her great-grandchildren and helped destroy 2 royal dynasties. She did not know. She would not know until it was far too late. The first 10 years of her marriage to Albert were, by every public account, the happiest decade of 19th-century European royalty. They lived between three houses: Buckingham Palace in London, Windsor Castle on the Thames, and a private estate Albert himself designed at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. They acquired a fourth, Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands, in 1852. They worked side by side every morning at twin desks in Albert's study. He read her dispatches, drafted her speeches, advised her on legislation, foreign policy, and the management of her ministers. He was, in everything but name, the co-monarch of an empire that already covered nearly a fifth of the Earth's surface. He was also her husband. By the standards of any 19th-century marriage, royal or otherwise, they were extraordinarily, almost embarrassingly, in love. Albert built at Osborne House a set of 9 separate bathing huts on the beach, one for each of their children. He designed them himself, chose the wood, and ordered the small brass plaques engraved with each child's name. The huts faced the Solent with glass windows. On summer mornings, the entire family would walk down in single file, Victoria leading, Albert behind, the 9 children in order of age between them. The pressure to produce heirs was relentless. Vicky was born in 1840, Bertie, the future Edward Vere, in 1841, Alice in 1843, Alfred, called Affy, called Lenchen in 1846, Louise in 1848, Arthur in 1850, Leopold in 1853, and finally, Beatrice, called Baby by her mother for the rest of her own long life, in 1857, 9 children in 17 years. By the time Beatrice was born in April 1857, Queen Victoria was 38 years old. She had been pregnant, by any reasonable medical calculation, for more than 72 of the previous 203 months of her marriage. She nursed none of her own children. She did not believe in it. She would write in a private letter to her eldest daughter Vicky in 1859 that breastfeeding was the ruin of the most refined and intellectual young lady, and that she herself had always considered infants, particularly very young ones, frightful when undressed. The journal entry Victoria wrote on the morning after her own wedding night, an entry so explicit, so emotionally exposed, so entirely unbecoming of the Iron Widow she would later become, was an entry her youngest daughter, Beatrice, would personally cut from the bound diary and burn in a fire pit at Osborne House 60 years later. We will never know what it said. To understand the Victoria the world saw at her peak, the Victoria who stood on the balcony at Buckingham Palace on the afternoon of May 1, 1851, watching the great exhibition open at the Crystal Palace with her 4 eldest children gathered around her and her husband Albert at her side. You have to understand what she had already built by the age of 31. She had ruled Britain for 14 years. She had survived 7 assassination attempts. She had given birth to 7 children, all of whom were alive and well. She had made her husband the most influential consort in English royal history. She had, with him, designed a model of the modern royal family that would shape every reigning house in Europe for the next century. She had, in every measurable way, the most successful marriage and family in the entire Western world. She had everything, everything. 10 years later, almost to the day, she would be a widow. Her husband would be dead at 42. Her son Bertie would be the man she would publicly blame, in private letters that survived the bonfires, for the death she could not bring herself to attribute to anything as ordinary as illness. Her oldest daughter Vicky would be in Berlin, 3 months pregnant with a son who would grow up to start a world war. And the small, perfect family she had assembled on that balcony in 1851 would already be, beneath the surface, breaking apart. There is a photograph from the summer of 1857 taken at Osborne House on the lawn outside Albert's private cottage. Victoria is seated in a wicker chair, 38 years old, holding the 4-month-old Beatrice, the last child she would ever bear, in her lap. Albert stands behind her, one hand on her shoulder. Around them, in a careful semicircle, are the other 8 children. Vicky stands at the back, 16, already engaged to marry the future German emperor. Bertie stands beside her, 15, smiling at the camera. Alice, 14, Affie, 12, Lenchen, 10, Louise, 8, Arthur, 7, and Leopold, small, pale, almost translucent at 4 years old, sits cross-legged on the grass at his mother's feet. What no biographer of Queen Victoria has ever fully addressed is that the photograph from that afternoon was, by the time Victoria herself died in January 1901, the only surviving image of all 9 of her children together in good health. By the time she lay dying at Osborne 40, 4 years later, 3 of the children in that photograph were already in their graves. Something Albert had said to her in private on the evening before that photograph was taken. Something he would not repeat publicly. Something Victoria would carry to her own grave, would explain why she would never, after his death, look at a photograph of her own family without flinching. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about Queen Victoria. She did not believe she would ever survive the loss of her husband. She had said it in her diary, in her letters, repeatedly to her ladies in waiting, and to her own mother before her mother died. The day Albert died, she had said, would be the day Victoria herself effectively ceased to exist. That day was coming, it was 4 years away, and the man who would, in her view, because it was her own eldest son. The summer of 1861 was, by every external measure, a summer of celebration. Princess Alice, 18, gentle, intellectually serious, the third of Victoria and Albert's 9 children, had been formally engaged in April to Prince Louis of Hesse and by Rhine. The wedding was to take place the following summer at Osborne House. Princess Vicky, by then 20, 3 years into her own marriage to the future German Emperor Frederick Catherine and mother of 2 small children, had returned to Windsor for the summer with her husband and infant son. Prince Albert was 41. He had been Prince Consort for 21 years. By the summer of 1861, he was the most powerful and the most quietly resented German in British public life. He was tired. By his own admission in private letters to his wife, he was suffering from chronic stomach pain. He had not slept well in nearly 2 years, but he was alive. He was working. He was planning the next phase of his beloved son Bertie's military training. Above Albert's desk at Windsor Castle hung a single small framed pencil drawing, drawn by Albert himself, signed and dated 1859, of his eldest son Bertie asleep in an armchair. Beneath it, in Albert's own hand, was a single line in German. Was Word aus diesem Jungen? What will become of this boy? He would not live to find out. Because in early September of 1861, 3 months before Albert's death, Bertie would do something at a military camp in Ireland that would, in his own mother's view, kill the man who had drawn that picture. The military camp was at the Curragh in County Kildare, Ireland, the largest army training facility in the British Isles. Albert had personally arranged for his 19-year-old son to spend 10 weeks there as part of an attachment to the Grenadier Guards. The official goal was to give the future king his first real exposure to military command. The unofficial goal, discussed only between Albert and Victoria in letters that survived the later bonfires, was to expose Bertie to the discipline, structure, and moral seriousness of barracks life. Albert believed his son was lazy, easily distracted, and in some unspecified but persistent way, unsuitable for the throne. Bertie arrived at the Curragh in late June 1861. He did not enjoy it. He was small for his age, uncomfortable in his uniform, and by every account from his fellow officers agreeable but unimpressive. His fellow officers decided to help him. On the night of September 6, 1861, 3 of them smuggled a young Irish actress named Nellie Clifton into the heir apparent's tent. She was 22, vivacious and quick-witted. She stayed the night. She returned the following weekend, and every weekend for the remaining 6 weeks of his attachment. Bertie did not tell his father or his mother. He returned to Cambridge in late October 1861, resumed his studies, attended chapel, and wrote to his sister Vicky in Berlin that the Curragh had been more agreeable than I had feared. But the officers at the Curie had told other officers, who told their wives, who told their friends. By the second week of November, the story had reached London. By the third week, Buckingham Palace. By the fourth week, Albert. Albert was already physically unwell. He had been complaining of stomach pain, headaches, and insomnia since late October. His physician had recommended bed rest. Albert had refused. On the morning of November 25, 1861, 3 days after the full report on Bertie's behavior was placed in his hands, Albert boarded a train in cold rain, travelled to Cambridge, and confronted his 19-year-old son in person about the actress in the tent. He returned to Windsor that evening with a fever the next morning. He would never recover. The Irish actress, the woman who had spent 6 weekends in the heir apparent's tent, would, by the end of December, find herself written into Queen Victoria's private correspondence as the woman who had killed her husband. Victoria would not name her in public or write her name aloud, but in letters to Vicky in Berlin, she would refer to Nellie only as that wretched creature, and she would refer to her son Bertie for the rest of her own life with 3 different words: I never can or shall look at him without a shudder. Prince Albert died at 10:50 in the evening on Saturday, December 14, 1861. The official cause of death recorded was typhoid fever. Modern medical historians have proposed several alternative diagnoses: chronic kidney failure, Crohn's disease, even an undiagnosed abdominal cancer. The truth has never been fully established. No autopsy was permitted. What is documented is this: Princess Alice was at her father's bedside. She had been there almost continuously for 11 days. She was 18. She had nursed him through fever, delirium, and the long quiet hours when the doctors had nothing left to offer, and Victoria herself had retreated sobbing to the next room. Alice had read to him, bathed his forehead, held his hand. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Albert opened his eyes for the last time. He looked at his daughter. He could no longer speak. He raised his right hand slowly, deliberately, and placed it palm down on top of hers. He held it there. According to Alice's own account, he kept his hand on hers for almost 20 minutes before his breathing changed. She did not move. She did not call her mother. She held still. Victoria entered the room at approximately 10:40 p.m., summoned by her lady-in-waiting. She had run from her own apartments in her dressing gown, hair unbound. She was 42. She knelt at the side of the bed and took her husband's other hand. He died 10 minutes later. He did not speak. He did not regain consciousness. The last person to whom Albert was conscious, the last person whose hand he held, the last face he looked at, was not his wife. It was his daughter. Alice was 18. She had nursed him for 11 days. She would never recover emotionally from those 11 days. And she would die exactly 17 years later, to the day of a disease she contracted while nursing her own dying child. Victoria's grief was, by every modern psychological standard, pathological. She did not appear in public for 3 years. She did not enter Parliament for over a decade. She wore black every day for the remaining 39 years of her life. She slept beside a photograph of Albert on the pillow next to her own. She had his bedclothes laid out every morning by his valet. She had hot water brought to his washstand the same hour every day for the next 40 years. And what Albert had said to her on the evening before that family photograph at Osborne House in 1857, what he had whispered to her in the privacy of their marriage, was a single sentence Victoria recorded in her diary that night. The diary entry survived the bonfires. It read, said to me tonight, looking out at the children on the lawn, that he feared he had been a poor father to them, that he had loved them but had not understood them. I told him this was not so. He did not answer. The next 4 years of Queen Victoria's life were, by her own admission, the closest she came to ending it. She wrote in letter after letter to Vicky that she was longing to be with him. She refused to wear colour, attend public functions, or even sign official state papers without weeping over them. She withdrew almost completely to Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands. At Balmoral in the autumn of 1864, her household physician suggested she might find psychological benefit in the company of an old Highland servant who had once accompanied Albert on deer-stalking expeditions. The servant's name was John Brown. He was 38 tall, strongly built, ginger, bearded, and entirely unimpressed by royalty. He addressed the Queen from their first meeting as "woman." She did not correct him. What John Brown was to Queen Victoria for the next 18 years, until his own death in 1883, has been the single most rumored, most denied, most quietly investigated relationship of 19th century British royal history. Whether they were lovers secretly married, or simply the deepest platonic friendship of Victoria's adult life, has never been established. Something John Brown told Victoria at Balmoral on a single afternoon in the autumn of 1865, a single sentence about her son Bertie, the boy she had publicly blamed for her husband's death, would change permanently what Victoria allowed herself to feel about her own children. Brown had said, "Woman, that boy is no more guilty of his father's death than I am. He grieves it as you grieve it. The difference is that you have allowed yourself to say so. He has not." Victoria did not respond. She did not, however, ever again refer to Bertie publicly as the cause of Albert's death. She never apologized to him in person. She never fully forgave him, but she stopped saying it aloud. Now we must talk about a small boy named Leopold. He was born on April 7, 1853, at Buckingham Palace, the eighth of Victoria and Albert's 9 children, the 4th son. The birth was the most physically difficult of all Victoria's 9 pregnancies. Her personal physician, Sir John Snow, the same Sir John Snow who had identified the source of the London cholera epidemic 2 years earlier, was permitted to administer chloroform during the final stages of delivery. The Anglican Church had publicly criticized the use of pain relief in childbirth as a violation of divine instruction, but Victoria ignored them. The boy who emerged was by every external measure perfectly formed, 7 pounds, crying, nursing, sleeping. But within his small body, present from the moment of conception, encoded in a single broken protein his mother had passed to him without ever knowing she carried it, was a disease that no doctor in 1853 had a name for. It would, by the time Leopold was 4, make his entire childhood a slow, careful, grief-soaked education in everything he was forbidden to do. The doctors of 1853 did not yet understand haemophilia, an X-linked recessive genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting normally. A small bruise, a fall, a stumble, a scraped knee can become a bleeding event that will not stop on its own. The first severe bleeding episode occurred when Leopold was approximately 14 months old. He fell from a small chair in the nursery at Buckingham Palace and cut his lip. The cut was minor, perhaps half an inch long, perhaps a quarter of an inch deep, but it bled for nearly 4 hours. Victoria herself sat on the nursery floor for the entire 4 hours, holding her son in her lap, watching him grow paler as the blood soaked through cloth after cloth. The bleeding finally stopped around 300 a.m. Leopold survived. The broken gene that Victoria had carried in her own body since her own conception. A gene she had inherited from a parent we will never definitively identify. A gene that had lain silent for 34 years before it expressed itself in her 8th child, was finally announced to the world. The doctors did not yet have a name for what was wrong with Leopold, but they knew something was very wrong. And they knew it had come from his mother. Leopold was forbidden from running, climbing trees, riding horses except at a slow walk, swimming, playing with toy swords, or any sport involving physical contact. He was, however, permitted to read, and he read everything. By 14, he spoke fluent French and German. By 18, he had been admitted to Christ Church, Oxford, the only one of Victoria's 9 children to attend a British university. He studied modern history, attended lectures by John Ruskin, and befriended Lewis Carroll, who would later dedicate one of his books to Leopold's memory. He was also, by every account from his university friends, the wittiest of Victoria's children, sharp, sarcastic. uniquely willing to say in private what nearly every member of the British aristocracy was thinking about the Queen's public mourning, her refusal to appear at state functions, and her treatment of Bertie. Leopold kept a private journal during his 3 years at Oxford, writing daily in 3 languages, English for routine entries, German for emotional ones, and a cipher of his own invention for entries he did not want any household servant to read. The journals survive in the royal archives. Examined by only a handful of scholars, none have published a full transcript, because Leopold's cipher entries, written in his own hand in the back of the 3rd surviving volume, contain observations about his own mother that, if published in his lifetime, would have caused a constitutional crisis. He never intended for them to be read. He died before he could destroy them. They remain to this day sealed. Leopold left Oxford in 1876. He requested a position as private secretary to his mother. She refused. She had Beatrice, by then 19, already serving in that role. He requested a diplomatic appointment overseas. She refused. The climate, she said, would kill him. He requested permission to marry the woman he loved. She refused for nearly 6 years. She finally relented in 1881. The wedding took place in April 1882. He had 3 years to live. Princess Alice, Victoria's 3rd child, the daughter who had held Albert's hand as he died, had married Prince Louis of Hesse in July 1862. 7 months after her father's death, she moved to Darmstadt and gave birth to 7 children in 14 years. She named her second daughter, born in June 1872, Alex Victoria Helena Louise Beatrice, after her mother, her grandmother, and her 2 living sisters. That little girl would grow up to marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, become Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna. Carry the same broken gene her grandmother had carried, and see that gene destroy her own son and help bring down the entire Russian Empire. In November 1878, Alice was 35, living in Darmstadt with Louis and their 7 children. In the 2nd week of November, the youngest, 4-year-old May, fell ill with what was first believed to be a cold. It was diphtheria. The disease swept through the household with terrifying speed. By the 3rd week, 6 of the 7 children were ill. By the end of November, 3 were critically ill. On November 16, 4-year-old May died. Alice nursed her dying daughter alone for the final 2 days of the child's life. After May died, Alice gathered her surviving children to her bedside to break the news. Her physician had instructed her not to touch them. Diphtheria was understood to be highly contagious. She agreed. She stood at the doorway. She began to speak. Then her eldest son, Ernie, aged 10, began to cry. He ran to his mother and threw his arms around her neck. Alice, exhausted and grieving, kissed him on the forehead. She contracted diphtheria within 48 hours. She died on December 14, 1878, 17 years to the day after her father had died in her arms. The 14th of December had returned. Princess Louise, Victoria's 6th child and 4th daughter, was the most artistically gifted of all the royal siblings, a sculptor who studied at the National Art Training School in South Kensington, the only one of Victoria's daughters to receive formal artistic training. She married in March 1871 the Marquis of Lorne, a Scottish aristocrat, the first commoner to marry a British princess in over 300 years. The marriage produced no children. What has been most quietly investigated and most consistently denied about Princess Louise's life is that her marriage was never sexually consummated. Whether because of the Marquis's own preferences, an injury Louise had sustained in childhood, or a private arrangement they had reached together, has never been established. The household physician's notes survive in the royal archives. The pages devoted to Princess Louise have been sealed until 2039. We know only that he recorded enough that the present royal household has determined we are not yet permitted to read it. But Louise's silence on her own marriage was not the silence that would, in the next decade of Queen Victoria's life, break her completely. That silence belonged to her son Leopold. Leopold, by then 30, married for 23 months, father of an 11-month-old daughter, travelled to the south of France in March 1884 on his physician's recommendation. The English winter had been hard on him. He had bled from minor injuries twice in January and once in early February. He needed warmth and quiet. His wife Helen, 8 months pregnant with their second child, remained behind in Surrey. Leopold arrived in Cannes on March 22. He spent his first 3 days reading, walking slowly, dining quietly. On the morning of March 27, he slipped on a tiled floor, fell, and hit his head against the corner of a marble step. The cut was small. The bleeding at first did not seem severe. He was carried to his bed on March 28, 1884, of a brain hemorrhage that the local physician, having no understanding of his hereditary condition, was entirely unable to stop. He was 30 years old. The broken gene Victoria had passed to her son Leopold without ever knowing she carried it. The gene that had made his entire short life a careful negotiation with his own bloodstream had finally killed him. He left behind a daughter who would not remember him, a wife who would give birth to the son he would never see 4 months later, and a mother who, at 64, was just beginning to understand what she had given to all of her children. John Brown died on March 27, 1883, less than a year before Leopold. The official cause was erysipelas, a bacterial infection almost universally fatal in older patients in 1883. He was 56. He had been at Queen Victoria's side almost continuously for 19 years. Victoria, then 63, was inconsolable. She wrote to Vicky, "Perhaps never in history was there so strong and true an attachment, so warm and loving a friendship between the sovereign and servant. The Queen feels that life for the second time is become most trying and sad to bear, deprived of all she so needs." She had used the same word, deprived, only once before in her private correspondence. She had used it on December 15, 1861, the morning after Albert died. Victoria commissioned a marble statue of John Brown, placed in the gardens at Balmoral at the spot where he had stood every morning to receive her instructions. She wrote a private memoir of him, a manuscript of approximately 300 pages in her own hand, which she intended to publish. She was prevented only by the direct and personal intervention of her son Bertie and her private secretary. The manuscript was locked in a cabinet at Windsor Castle and destroyed after her death. Prince Alfred, called Afy by his family, the second eldest son and fourth of Victoria's 9 children, had married in January 1874 the Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia, the only daughter of Tsar Alexander II. The marriage united the British and Russian royal families for the first time in over a century. It produced 5 children. The eldest and only son was a boy named Alfred Jr., born in October 1874, by every account the most physically beautiful of all Queen Victoria's grandsons, resembling his father, with his mother's pale grey eyes, fluent in 4 languages by 14. He was also, by his early 20s, quietly and severely depressed. The exact circumstances of what happened in Meiningen, Germany, on the evening of January 22, 1899, have never been fully documented. The official account states that 24-year-old Prince Alfred Jr. had been suffering from chronic respiratory illness, and that his death on February 6, 1899 was from natural causes accelerated by alcohol consumption. The unofficial account, given in private letters by 3 different members of the Coburg household, states that on the evening of January 22, in his private rooms, Prince Alfred Jr. attempted to take his own life with a revolver. He did not succeed instantly. He survived for 14 days. He died on February 6, 1899. He was 24. Afy, then 54, the reigning Duke of Saxe, Coburg and Gotha, the only son Victoria had left in active reign anywhere in Europe, was never the same after that month. The last letter young Alfred had written before that night in January 1899 was found in his writing desk 3 days after his death, addressed to his mother, but never sent. It read in part, "Mama, I cannot any longer live in this body. I am sorry." Afy was diagnosed with throat cancer in May 1900. The disease was inoperable. He died on July 30, 1900, at 55. the second of Victoria's 9 children to die before her. The first had been Alice, 22 years earlier, on the date that returned. The third would die 7 months after Victoria herself. The third was Vicky, the eldest of Victoria's 9 children, the Princess Royal, Empress Frederick of Germany, mother of Kaiser Wilhelm II. She had married Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia in January 1858 at 17. She had given birth to a son named Wilhelm in January 1859, whose left arm had been catastrophically damaged during the breech delivery, an injury Wilhelm would conceal beneath specially tailored uniforms for the rest of his life. She gave birth to 8 children total. She became Empress of Germany in March 1888 for 99 days before her husband Frederick III died of throat cancer. Their eldest son Wilhelm ascended the throne at 29 and systematically isolated his mother from German political life, from the court, from her own household. Vicky lived at Friedrichshof, the small castle she had built with her father's inheritance, from 1894 onward, alone. In early 1899, at 58, at the same time her brother Affy's only son was dying in Meiningen, she was diagnosed with cancer of the spine. Her German physicians gave her less than 3 years. She did not tell her mother. She did not, for nearly 2 years, tell anyone in England at all. She continued her weekly letters to Victoria, letters she had been writing without interruption since 1858, letters that had accumulated into the thousands, writing about the weather, her grandchildren, the gardens at Friedrichshof. She did not write about the disease destroying her spinal cord vertebra by vertebra. Her most private letters, containing her actual condition, pain, and terror of dying alone in a country whose new emperor was her own son, reached England through a system her loyal English groom had devised. The letters were sewn into the leather lining of horse saddles, carried by trusted couriers across the German border, delivered to Windsor Castle in the dead of night. 2 survive in the royal archives. The rest were never recovered. Queen Victoria died first. She died on January 22, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She was 81. She had reigned for 63 years and 7 months. She was attended in her final hour by her physician, her son Bertie, by then 59, the man she had spent 40 years not forgiving, the man who would become King Edward II within the hour, and her grandson Wilhelm, the German emperor, who had travelled from Berlin to be at her bedside. She did not ask for Vicky. Vicky was too ill to travel. She had by January 1901 lost the use of her legs. Her own son, the emperor, had given strict instructions that she was not to be informed when her mother's condition became critical. She learned of her mother's death by reading it in a German newspaper. The letter Princess Alice had written to her mother in November 1878. The letter she had begun after little May died but could not finish, was a letter Victoria did not receive until 8 months after Alice's own death. It had been held by the Hesse physician and sent through diplomatic channels. Victoria opened it alone at Osborne House on the morning of August 15. The letter ended in mid-sentence. The final words Alice had written, words Victoria would carry folded inside her diary for the remaining 22 years of her life, were, "Dearest Mama, I have been thinking lately of Papa and how he held my hand at the end. I have wondered all these years whether he meant by it to ask me to..." The sentence was never finished. We do not know what Albert had asked her, or what Alice had understood him to ask. We know only that Victoria folded the letter in half, placed it inside her diary, and never spoke of its contents to anyone for the remaining 22 years of her life. Vicky outlived her mother by exactly 226 days. She died on August 5, 1901, at Friedrichshof, in the small bedroom she had decorated with English wallpaper imported from London. She was 60. She had spent her final months in extraordinary pain. Her German physicians, on the orders of her son, had refused her morphine in the doses her English physicians had recommended. She had screamed. She had lost consciousness for hours at a time. She was visited in those final weeks by her brother Bertie, by then King Edward VI, who travelled to Friedrichshof in secret, against the formal protest of his nephew the Kaiser to be at his sister's side. Before he left Germany, he arranged for the contents of her private writing desk to be smuggled out of the country. The letters sewn into the leather lining of horse saddles. The letters that left Friedrichshof in those saddles would reveal to Bertie, when he read them alone in his private study, what his mother Victoria had spent 40 years refusing to see. Vicky had loved her mother, but she had also been afraid of her. She had spent her entire adult life editing her letters in real time to remove anything that might displease her mother. The Vicky her mother had known was only one of the 2 daughters who had lived inside that body. She was buried beside her husband Friedrich Thu at the Friedenskirche in Potsdam. Her son Wilhelm did not, in his entire life thereafter, speak publicly about his mother again. Princess Beatrice, Victoria's youngest child, called baby by her mother for the first 16 years of her life, was 43 when her mother died. She had married a German prince named Henry of Battenberg in July 1885. Victoria had violently opposed the marriage, eventually relenting only on the condition that Beatrice and Henry live with her permanently. Beatrice agreed. She spent the next 16 years as her mother's full-time private secretary. Henry did not last. He volunteered for a military expedition against the Ashanti in West Africa to escape the suffocation of life inside Victoria's household. He contracted malaria and died on January 20, 1896 on a hospital ship. Beatrice was 38 with 4 children. She returned to her mother's side and remained there until Victoria's death 5 years later. What Princess Beatrice did over the next 30 years, on the explicit instructions her mother had left her in a final document signed 3 weeks before her death, was the most systematic and determined act of historical destruction ever undertaken by a member of the British royal family. She edited every page of Queen Victoria's private diaries. The diaries filled more than 120 bound volumes, written almost daily for nearly 70 years, containing more than 2.5 million words. Beatrice rewrote them by hand into new bound volumes, editing as she went, removing every passage she believed her mother would not have wanted made public. References to John Brown. References to Princess Louise's marriage. References to Bertie's behavior at the Curragh. References to Albert's private fears about his children. References to Leopold's medical condition before diagnosis. References to her own father's final hours that did not match the public account. Every page she finished rewriting, she burned in a small fire pit in the courtyard at Osborne House. She burned them daily for 30 years, from the spring of 1901 until her own physical decline in 1932. The journal entry Victoria had written on the morning after her own wedding night, so explicit, so emotionally exposed, so unbecoming of the Iron Widow she would later become, was the very first page Beatrice burned on April 14, 1901, 82 days after her mother's death. We will never know what it said. The cipher entries Leopold had written in the back of his Oxford diary, containing his observations about his own mother. Entries that would have caused a constitutional crisis if published in his lifetime, were the second category Beatrice was instructed to destroy. She did not burn them. She separated them from the rest of the journal, placed them alone in a sealed envelope, and sent them to the Royal Archives with a single instruction: these are not to be read in any present generation. They remain sealed to date. What Beatrice burned in her courtyard at Osborne House, the diaries, letters, photographs, documents her mother had instructed her to destroy, was, by the most conservative estimate of historians, more than 2/3 of the entire surviving private record of the most documented life of the 19th century. We do not know what Queen Victoria thought, in private, about most of the people she loved most. The bonfires in the courtyard saw to it that we never will. Remember the date from the beginning. The 14th of December, the night Prince Albert died holding his daughter Alice's hand in 1861. The night his daughter Alice died of diphtheria contracted from a kiss she gave her own dying child. Exactly 17 years later, Queen Victoria, who had outlived her husband by 40 years, who had outlived 3 of her 9 children, who had ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen, who had carried inside her body a single broken gene that would help destroy the Russian Empire, the Spanish royal line, and the German monarchy her own grandson would lead into world war, never wrote in her surviving diary about the fact that the 2 people she had loved most in her entire life had died on the same date, in the same week of the year. Beatrice may have removed it, or Victoria may simply have been unable to write it down. She gave birth to 9 children in 17 years. She arranged their marriages into every reigning house in Europe. She built with her husband Albert the model of the modern royal family that every monarchy on the continent would copy for the next century. She controlled, by the time of her death, the political destiny of nearly a third of the human population. And in the end, in a small bedroom at Osborne House on a January morning in 1901, with her son the new king and her grandson the German emperor at her bedside, she became exactly what every mother who outlives her own children eventually becomes quiet alone survived. If Queen Victoria's story moved you, then you need to hear about her granddaughter, the small German princess born in the same diphtheria-cursed Hesse household where Victoria's daughter, Alice, had died. The young woman who married into the most powerful dynasty in Eastern Europe, who carried into her own marriage the same broken gene her grandmother had carried into hers. Her name was Alix of Hesse. She became Serena Alexandra of Russia, and what happened to her in a basement in Yekaterinburg in the dark hours of July 17, 1918, with her 4 daughters and her 1 fragile, bleeding son around her, was the final, terrible act of the genetic prophecy Queen Victoria had passed to her without ever knowing it was hers to give.